Okay, so welcome ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is this House believes that major tourist destinations should significantly limit the number of tourists that can visit. Representing the proposition we have team from Australia, and on the opposition we have team from Sri Lanka. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Sam, second speaker Will, third speaker Alice, and the reply speaker is Will. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Amar, second speaker Titira, third speaker Afra, and the reply speaker Titira. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and the last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information, POIs, may not be offered. The judge will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judges. Good luck, everyone.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 5th round of WSDC 2024. My name is Molly, and I will answer share her, but I would prefer if you address the panel as a whole. Now I'm going to let our panel to introduce themselves from my furthest left to right. Hello everyone, my name is Matt. Good luck in this round.
Hello, my name is Philip. I will be our panelist today, speaking, but also the rest of the panelists as well.
Hello, I'm Vital.
And just a couple of housekeeping rules. I will be doing the clapping and doing engage with POIs. Try to take at least one, preferably 2, during your speeches, because they're quite important. Are there any questions before we start? No? In that case, I would like to call on first opposition speaker to start. Give me
Do you mind if I move this?
Sorry?
Do you mind if I move this? The ancient city of Petra is eroding because too many people are walking over it. Melbourne is in a housing crisis where employed people are sleeping in their cars because every long-term rental has been turned into an Airbnb. Communities in the Amazon are having their land taken away from them to be turned into resorts. Things are at a breaking point. The only solution is tourist caps. Now, onto our framing. Firstly, what is our model? In order to facilitate a significant reduction in the number of tourists, we support a system of destination permits. Now, the first note is that we would wean countries off tourism. This would not happen immediately. This would be a gradual process. If someone wants to go to a major tourist destination, they apply for a permit a year in advance. These permits are limited in number. 50% of them are done based on a random lottery system. The other 50% are done based on auctions, with the money going straight to the government to spend on things like conservation and job transitions. People are obviously willing to pay a lot of money because destinations are very much in demand. These are enforced by accommodation checking your destination permit, like how they ask for passport to check in. There will be heavy fines, revocation of license and so on. This will be well enforced. People who miss out on this permit, no thank you, at peak times can apply for permits in non-peak times, spreading out tourism over the year. Every government already identifies who tourists are when they're allocating visas. For the sake of the debate, this is not people who are conducting businesses, visiting family, or studying in a country. These are different visa classes. Now, I'm moving to my first point of substantive on the exploitative nature of tourism. No thank you. Firstly, on the environment that tourism occurs in. The environment and culture of major tourist destinations is exploited to a point of breaking. One, because many tourists are irresponsible or have malicious intentions. They might be on a stag trip with the lads. They might be taking the experience for granted. This is like littering, this is like graffiti, this looks like ignoring local laws and regulations. This is much less likely on our side because they're either very lucky or have spent a lot of money. No thank you, they are more interested in their destination, and therefore they are more likely to respect their destination. Even on their side, when tourists are well-intentioned, they still cause harms because of their presence. There's things like environmental degradation from walking over a path too often, poor sanitation, pollutions from flights and cruises. This simply happens because a large number of people are in a place that is not designed for them. Some of the world's best surfing beaches have been made unsurfable because of the construction of oceanside property that impact wave breaks. Now, also, tourists must live somewhere, eat somewhere, do something with their days. This means we have to build airports, hotels, and so on. These are built on forested land or local communities, not on empty land. this impacts the environment and locals. Now, onto how tourism impacts local culture. No, thank you. So culture is exploited as well as the environment because tourists fill places like churches, which means that locals who actually want to worship there cannot fit in. They have to get tickets and so on. Even if they can access it, they're deprived of the ability to enjoy them spiritually because they're covered in graffiti, they're full of people, as I told you. Even if they can access it, there is pressure to bastardize local culture, turning it into a commercial and sellable product for tourists. For example, in Hawaii, luau celebrations have traditionally been reserved for very important occasions like the birth of a child, like victory in a war. But now, multiple are thrown per night as an exotically branded party aimed at tourists with sexualized waitresses. This is extremely degrading for a local whose culture is being turned into a product. This happens everywhere. Japanese kimonos being turned into a vessel to get extra tips. Traditional healing practices like massage being fetishized and serving as an entrance into sex tourism. This is incredibly harmful. Why should you weigh this? Firstly, on the environment and built culture, you must remember that people go to incredibly beautiful places, places that are incredibly important to humanity, the Great Barrier Reef, the Vatican, and so on. We have an obligation to future generations to protect these incredibly important places by not completely degrading them. Opposition harms them significantly over tourism. No, thank you. On culture, these are places with historic and important and ongoing culture, particularly to Indigenous people. Opposition is essentially resurrecting colonialisation as they allow large numbers of foreigners to come in and exploit culture and land for a fun summer abroad. I'll take a point for a movement to my next substantive.
If your policy is that vandalism and graffiti, why can't you place regulations against what's happening?
Firstly, there are far too many tourists to place regulation. We see in the status quo that vandalism and graffiti already happens because there are simply too many tourists to effectively police. Since we have less tourists, the police resources are stretched less thin. We get better management of graffiti. And secondly, even if you don't buy that, there is still harm by tourists physically being there, even if they're well-intentioned, as I told you, you still get those harms. Now, onto economics. So opposition is likely going to run a case that tells you tourism is really important for local economies. I'm going to explain why that's not the case, why it's actually harmful. So, firstly, on the actual scale of benefits that tourism brings to a local country. Many foreign tourists prefer to stay at Western-style hotels, go to Western-style resorts and theme parks. No, thank you, because they feel safe there, because they feel accommodated there, they trust the food, and so on. These institutions are run by large multinational companies, like the Crown Plaza we're staying at, which is run by IHG, an international company, and these companies are based offshore, they're headquartered offshore, they know how to exploit tax loopholes. Therefore, in general, the largest amount of money does not go to the local country. No, thank you. The comparative is our auction system, where the money goes straight to the local government. There's likely to be a very large benefit, so we get a good amount of money on our side. Secondly, on housing crisis. So, as more workers are required to fill jobs in tourist areas, they move into these big cities and they push locals out. Also, as tourists with more money are able to move into these areas, they pay more for things like Airbnbs, which pushes locals out. It becomes virtually impossible to find a place to live as an ordinary person living in these cities. They're forced out of the city, they're forced into homelessness in places like Barcelona, Byron Bay, and Brighton. Next, inflation. Wealthy tourists with lots of money to spend and a desire to spend it are willing to pay far more than locals for basic things like medicine, food and groceries, and so on. This causes local businesses to push up the prices to match, which makes it much harder to live, and it outstrips the growth in wages caused by increased standards of living to the extent they exist. And finally, tourists have an incentive to go to businesses because of advertising. They're only there for a week, they've never been to the place, and they're likely never going to go back to, for instance, a restaurant. So the incentive is for this restaurant to advertise really well and not spend so much money on services and the actual quality of food, since tourists have already been there. This means locals get worse services overall, since they're not designed for repeat customers, they're designed for one-off customers. Now, onto the biggest economic harm, which is economic dependency. I'll take a point first, though.
If your harm is that locals are worse off because of inflation, this is not true because local services are given separately and tourists are given separate packages that they need to purchase. Why is this harming the concept of letting locals?
Again, broadly this isn't true. Tourists obviously have to share things like the metro system to get around. When we were in Paris, we used the local metro system. There simply aren't alternatives to tourists. But also to the extent that the government's likely to spend more money on these services at the cost of things designed for locals, since tourists, as I told you, can pay more, so the government's incentive is to cater for them, not for locals. Now, onto the key economic impact, which is economic dependency. This is what happens when 30% of your economy is reliant on tourism. So, firstly, your economy is far more vulnerable to shocks outside of your control that impact the number of tourists significantly. This is things like terrorist attacks, things like global pandemics, things like changing international relations, even just, no thank you, the changing social pressures of where to go, what is popular on Instagram. This means that you can't control the number of tourists you get. This is a large economic shock. This is also true every single year because of the seasonality of tourism. People go in the summer, people go when they have holidays, which means that for half of the year, workers and businesses have no income stream or very little income stream, which means that they are unemployed or it's far harder to manage. Now, why is this particularly nefarious? Because tourism kills other industries. Because it is so lucrative for 6 months of the year, local capital flows significantly into tourism and talent at the cost of other industries in the region, so it's even more dependent. Next, inflation really hurts other industries because at the point at which the resources you need to run a business, at the point at which paper becomes more expensive because your currency is inflated, it's harder to run other businesses. And finally, environmental damage and congestion affect your productivity. If your metro ride takes an hour to get to work instead of 30 minutes because it's clogged up with tourists, this means you are less productive. Why can we successfully diversify? One, we get money from auctioning these permits, and we still have money from tourism in the off-season, which means that we have the money to diversify. Next, the government is forced to diversify. They can't milk the short-term cash cow of tourism. There is political pressure to find other businesses to go into since people still want jobs. And finally, there are other industries in all countries that can receive this investment. We don't have to say what they are, but for instance, things like fishing, agriculture, sea trade routes, manufacturing, whatever. There are huge other industries that countries can go into. It's particularly true in Western countries like Paris, like Rome, where obviously there are other investments that can happen. We support diversification. We are less reliant on tourism. So proud to propose.
I would like to thank the first speaker for the set of proposition for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon the first opposition to start the case for all. Here, here.
Am I audible if I speak like this? Perfect. Maybe a place like London might be fine the moment that you have a limit on tourists. But what happens to countries like Seychelles? What happens to countries like Sri Lanka? Because realistically, we have a couple of garment factories, but nothing much else. To these countries, tourism is not a choice, it is a necessity. It is something that keeps these countries afloat. From the person on the street selling seashell necklaces to the mid-level manager that runs a hotel, it's the lifeblood of these countries. They do not provide us with an alternative. Diversification is just asserted into this debate. Therefore, we think we are the only side that cares about the most vulnerable. Couple things in characterization, setup, before I move on to my responses, and finally my substantives. Firstly, I want to characterize that deterioration of these tourist sites is something that is inevitable, whether that be to climate change, where for example Venice is sinking not because of tourists but because of a rise in ocean levels, but also because these tourist sites are a place where rebuilding and repairing is something that always occurs. Take for example the Great Wall of China, where although it's considered to be a part of the Qin dynasty, it was actually mostly built in the Ming dynasty because it keeps getting rebuilt. Understanding this, we think that the process of rebuilding and keeping these sites maintained and up to date is something that happens better on our side when they are better funded, cared for, and given the attention that they deserve. But secondly, I want to point out that their characterization is very unrealistic because both sides have self-regulation incentives. Because if Machu Picchu is destroyed to the point where no one can come there, then obviously no one's going to want to visit Peru and they lose out on the cash cow that they obviously had. Meaning that on our side, governments won't be stupid, they are going to impose regulations to make sure that these places can be preserved to some degree. On to set up then, a couple of things. Firstly, I want to point out that this is a debate about volume and they need to prove to us why exactly limiting the number of tourists significantly is not only good for the economy, but is the tipping point for all these things that they claim to essentially save these sites. But on top of this, this debate is about a range of places. As much as it is about places like Athens or London, it is also a debate about places like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Costa Rica, Seychelles, countries that depend on people entering these places in order to survive. They need to lay out a plan for these countries, how they're suddenly going to diversify, why all the people won't be left starving. They haven't done that. We think that these are terrible. But secondly, what's a counter model in this debate? We can impose a countless numbers of regulations, whether that be crowd organization or control measures through ticketing or imposing time limits, whether that be incentivizing good behavior through social media and awareness campaigns, whether that be safety measures to protect degradation and damage, like for example better support structures in Machu Picchu, protective stone coverings in the Colosseum, and rebuilding these areas. We'd also have like regulations in these cities to prevent for the worst excesses to locals, where for example Madrid has certain streets reserved only for locals, or maybe on price caps on Airbnbs and such. Couple things in response before my argument. Three things. Firstly, they say that tourism is inherently exploitative and people act in irresponsible ways. We think that tourists are being educated and improved, particularly because of social media, where people are increasingly aware of like the detestable stag culture that needs to be avoided. But on top of this, we can support things like fines and regulation. Their only response in the POI to this is to say that surely regulation won't work because the police is stretched too thin. Why can we not ramp up the police then? Why can we not pay for better surveillance services? Why can we not beef up the ability to protect these areas? Regulation can work. Secondly, they say that you commercialize these places and this is inherently degrading. I want to flip this argument very quickly, because if these places are fetishized and isolated, the solution is greater globalization. Make people go to India to understand that the sari is a part of daily life and not some weird fetish object. Make people look at these cultures, see the people living there and understanding. Tourism solves a fetishization, it does not cause it. But on an even if level, I'm going to take it at the absolute best. Even if it's commercialized to some degree, that's absolutely fine. Even if like the elephant, who's a sacred part of Sri Lankan culture, is sold in the form of like key tags and postcards, if it means that a person can feed his family for that day, what's the harm in that? On net, it's a great thing. But the last point of response then, they say that they can diversify. I'd like to point out that if diversification was possible, these places would have done so anyway, because it makes economic sense and your voters are going to want that. Why exactly is it likely on their side? It is not sure. Okay then, on to arguments. Firstly, on why we're better for economic development, and secondly, on why we better preserve these sites. Firstly, on why we're better for economic development. Premise. Prior to the advent of tourism-based economies, these destinations were extremely impoverished and tourism was brought out as a necessity. Why? Firstly, because they have no meaningful comparative advantage. Maybe they lack mineral-rich land, maybe they lack resources, maybe they lack human capital. If a city is to survive in the middle of a desert or ocean, they need to find a way to generate value aside from traditional economic means. Tourism was that option for them. These are the people who this debate is most applicable to. But secondly, these are the areas that were left behind because of colonialism, because of historical injustices, which means that they were left with like weak currencies and such and needed to find a way to build their economies back up. These are places like Sri Lanka that then use this to make sure that tourism works as an alternative in these countries. Why do we then get more money for these places? One, because tourists have more disposable income. They enter in large numbers and hordes, and the cash goes into the pockets of local communities and businesses. These communities and businesses sell them goods and services at higher margins than they can to locals. Where, for example, in Kandalama, a traditional sarong priced at 20,000, who I as a local would never buy, a white person coming in would probably buy, because their currency is far more stronger than ours, and when converted to dollars, isn't even the like price of a subway fare for them. But two, the money circulates and goes beyond just the destination. The residents of Cebu may have gained disposable income when tourism first kicked off, but then this money is used to provide temporary stimulus loans to Liloan and Bonbon, and those residents can build livelihoods, put food on the table, and send their kids to school. This then creates an incentive for more local businesses, especially those unrelated to tourism industry, for example, say a restaurant in the region, to set up, because more people have more disposable income to make use of those services. Why then do we, given that we have more money for governments, does this benefit translate to a national level? Because increased tax revenue from the increased income of local communities means that we have more tax revenue to pay for the people, but also have access to foreign currency, and this is good because access to foreign currency and the transition to local currency means that you have more foreign reserves in your bank, in your government's bank, which means that you're more stable and you attract more investment, but also you're able to set up state enterprises in things like tourism, such as tourism sites, national parks, and cultural centers that directly earn money from tourists. Government spread this money. The initial investment will be used to grow tourism further, and the secondary incentive will also be to spread the benefits further. Where diversification now is possible because you have the funds to do so, and politically, governments are going to want to do this as well because diversification is likely something that is popular. Why is this exclusive? Because these benefits only manifest through large injections of money into the economy as opposed to small ones. Because on their side, even if they get like a couple injections far and few apart, they still don't have the amount of foreign currency required to establish your local currency as a strong one in order to attract investors and such. Moving on then to my second argument on why we are better for the preservation of these sites. Premise. The upkeep and maintenance of these tourist sites within these destinations requires high costs, within that governments lack the incentives to invest into this, where they lose their golden goose status. There are a couple reasons why. Because the upkeep And there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, we think that the upkeep of this place is going to be expensive regardless of the number of tourists. While these attractions are designed to be attractive and opulent, and maintaining them is going to be expensive because of the cultural heritage, where there's seasonality, where you need to make sure that these places are up to date even when it's in the off season, where natural deforestation and random accidents and such can happen, and where a number of these sites cannot be modernized and need to have the cultural element preserved into it. This means that the maintenance of these places takes cash that they do not have. Why do we exclusively have that cash then? Because on our side, tourists come in large numbers and bring in the money that you need. You make the kind of revenue that you so essentially desire in order to make sure that these places are maintained. But on top of this, there's a cultural volume of shared ownership, where, for example, the only reason the Notre Dame was sent so much aid to be built overall was because all people across the globe felt it was like a collective heritage, versus on their side, it becomes France and France's problem only. These incentives are exclusive to opposition, because on their side, politicians can no longer justify spending money to preserve these areas because there's no economic point. It's always going to be better to invest in tangible things like, say, welfare, education, and healthcare, meaning that these essential sites are the first to get slashed on their side, versus on our side, when there's a guaranteed economic benefit, when more people visit these sites and there's a large number of tourists coming in and cash is being pumped into the economy, we are better off and they are funded more. For those reasons, opposed.
You hear me all fine? Yep. It was never good for economies to be entirely dependent on one thing. That meant that maybe that industry was going to rise, but that came at the cost of having a diverse set of industries. If there was a terrorist attack in your country, tourism would go down, and if that was 30% of your economy, that was extremely harmful to be entirely dependent on that. That meant those people had no jobs, you were unable to rebound. When we redistribute you have a more diverse set in your economy, you were able to rebound better. We win on their own the impact they prove on try to prove on the economy. Three things in this speech. Firstly, on their win path, which is the economy, which I'll prove that we win, but even then, not that important. Secondly, on how it impacts local people that Sam explains is important to not much response. And lastly, this piece of substantive on why you get more vice tourism, impacting things like sex tourism, things like drugs, things like people just doing crimes in those countries are more likely to occur when you have more tourism. So firstly, on the economy, they tell you that they can do regulations. Three responses. Firstly, you probably already do it in many cases. It fails. Or you really believe that the Colosseum, they're not trying to protect it from graffiti. Obviously, they probably were, and it just ended up failing on their side. The same reason they give you, if they say, if you could diversify, you probably would already. If you could protect your sacred sites, you probably would try to already. You probably accrue that harm as well. Secondly, it's just so much easier to regulate when there are less people to regulate. People are able to slip through the cracks when there's like a bustling amount of people. When there are less of them there, it is far easier to regulate those people. But thirdly, I just dispute that you guys can do this regulation at all. You never explain why it requires less fiat than our side. I'd say it probably does require more fiat on your side for two reasons. Firstly, your first speaker explains you're economically dependent on that industry. When you're economically dependent on it, you're far less able to regulate it. You do not believe that regulating in the first place means they do not have the fiat to be able to do that. Because you're economically dependent on it, you cannot do the regulations because that would harm your economy, get heaps of political blowback. And secondly, you affect less people on our side. There are less tourists coming through, less people working in that industry. So we have far more political capital to be able to regulate it. I would dispute that they are able to do more regulations than us. We flipped that pretty clearly. Next thing to go on is they tell you that you get more, to explain how you get more money through the auction system than you get through adding each marginal tourist that you get on their side. Two reasons. Firstly, it's exclusive on our side, the auction system, so you pay a lot for this. People like to pay to go to private beaches. When you're paying for Paris to be exclusive, you pay far, far, far more money. That means it goes directly to the government. Their best mechanism on this is it goes to the hotels that are owned by Western companies, and maybe they don't have too much profit. They pay their workers some money, that goes to someone else, some trickle-down economics. We give it directly directly to the government, far more certain benefit on our side. The speculative chains of logic there are so unclear as how they get it and underexplained. Second reason is to explain is that the marginal returns of each tourist you're adding just get lower over time, that each tourist you add probably has less money to spend, is less likely to spend money. We keep the tourists that won't want to go the most, will spend the most amount of money, and we make it exclusive for them. They are likely to pay more on our side. That explains how we get more money than they do. Next thing to explain is that you're economically dependent on this industry, therefore it is bad for us to cut it. Note that we're doing this on phasing out on a period of time, so there's no instant harm that they point to. That falls out of the debate pretty quickly. 3 responses. Firstly, the only country with 50% is Macau, is 50% of their economy is tourism. The next closest one is 30%. That explains that given 70% of, at least 70% of every country basically is not dependent on tourism, you have the ability to diversify. You can go into those 70% things and just build them up. The industries already exist, but note there are new industries developing, things like AI that you can go into, be able to do that. You could have said 100 years ago that Hong Kong was in a nice place that had like nice temperatures and would be a nice tropical island and be like, oh, that would always be a tourist destination, why would it be anywhere else? Could have said the same thing for Singapore. They became other places. They can diversify even if you are like a Pacific island or in the Southeast Asia. Second response is, where are the vast majority of tourist destinations? When you think of it, it's places like New York, it's places like California, it's places like Paris, places like London. Those places can obviously diversify. They will be better off. And thirdly, is that we spend more money on skills retraining through the money that we get through the auction system, so we're more able to diversify on our side. Maybe they say, why haven't you diversified anyway? Because the Western companies push you to try not to diversify, because they're reaping all this money out of you. We have the fiat on our side to do it. We don't have to bypass through that system, so we are able to get you not economically dependent and be better off. Next claim they give you is to say that you get foreign currency and therefore be better off. 5 responses. Literally, what first? Why do I care? They never explain to you why I care about foreign currency. Currency reserves in countries are so small. Australia has 90 billion Australian dollars in their reserve bank foreign currency. The average traded daily on the Australian market in Australian currency is 500 billion Australian dollars. The currency reserves are so small, it's a drop in the ocean, does not matter. Second response is you sell less goods on your sides because you get things like Dutch disease. The price of the currency rises, which deletes all the other forms of the economy. If you sell less exports, it means you get less foreign currency from that. It is not a benefit. But thirdly, it's unclear that you get foreign currency on your side, because lots of people do things like trading the currency when they're in America and then fly overseas, so you never get the American currency because they trade it before they leave, because they want to know that they can definitely get it. They think they can get it at cheaper prices when they trade it in America for like Serbian currency, so they don't go and do it when they go overseas, they trade it back at home. Fourthly, is the vast majority of tourist places are in Western countries and they already have their own currency, right? They already have the euro, they already have the US dollar, they already have the Australian dollar. Why do they need the currency reserves? Entirely unclear from this team. They had to prove that the vast majority of places were in the non-Western world, and that also you traded the currency specifically there, and that wasn't even a trade-off of getting other industries. So many tainted logic that you fail to prove. Fifth thing is that we do things like building skills, which means people can go overseas, get remittances, and send it back to their family, and we get more currencies that way, because we spend more money diversifying the economy, building up skills, building up things like nurses so that we get excess, means that you can go overseas and then send back money on foreign currency. That explains how we win and flip most of our economy harms in the debate. I will take a POI.
Like you can see, London and New York have diversified while remaining bustling tourist sites without giving tourism up. Why can't Costa Rica have both, like say, beachside resorts and a bustling financial sector?
They can. That's why on our side the tourism goes from maybe like a large part of the economy to a less large part of the economy. Completely uncharitable. This debate's not, we would ban tourism. We still have some tourism on our side. You can still get those economic benefits. Don't let this team run away with the debate by not reading the motion. They have to be literal in this case. Next thing to prove in this debate is our harms that go relatively untouched about why it is better for local people. First thing they try and go is, well, local services are given separately to the people local, to the people that are international. A couple of responses. Firstly, governments don't have infinite money. Just because they're a tourist does not mean they can now also give money to local services. The way that France spent billions of dollars on cleaning up the Seine, which voters argued was a direct opportunity cost to doing things like funding hospitals and protested over, there are opportunity costs of spending money on tourists that you do not get to spend on your local people. But secondly, note that when it is incredibly crowded, things like buses, it is hard to scale up. It's hard to build new train lines in a city that has existed for 1,000 years and build where they are. When you've moved a bunch of hotels, how do you build more train lines there? They can't scale it up. It means that the trains just get incredibly crowded. Note this has 2 impacts. First, it feels incredibly bad for people to just have a bunch of tourists in their trains so they can't get to work. But secondly, note the productivity limits it lowers. People are less productive when it takes them longer to get to work. Third thing we push is that you have things like housing. You push people out of the city, which pushes them further away, makes it harder to give them services. And even if they are less effective because they just take longer. They say you can do things like cultural learning. We explain as whitewashed, and international visitors don't even impact your domestic politics, so it does not matter. Last thing they say is harms are caused by climate change, not caused by Venice. Would this team triple the amount of people going to Venice next year? And would that have an environmental impact on Venice? Probably would. They never explain to you to you that there aren't direct environmental harms. We tell you things like polluting waterways are not cause of climate change. The things people do when they are there, that is incredibly harmful to you. But what causes climate change? People doing more international flights, harm they accrue on their side. Next thing to explain is why we are better off this is my substantive on vice actions. This will explain how people do things more like sex work, hard drugs, and crimes for fun than they would do when we limit the amount of tourists. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, we have net less tourists, so even if this doesn't change people's propensity to do this, just having less of them means they're less likely to do things. Note that like cocaine production peaked in the world when the Euros were happening because there was lots of people going to one place where they thought they would all have cocaine, and that meant that there was more hard drugs being done there. Secondly, it's far easier to regulate on our side because firstly, it's smaller, and secondly, your economy is less dependent on those vice industries, so you're better off. Thirdly, lots of the tourism that's done for vice industries like sex work is often impulse things that people do. They go, oh, I want to fly there next week because I really want to do some drugs or something. That is less likely to happen when you have our auction system and when you have to sign up for permits. It's harder to do those impulse things that lead to vice drugs. But fourthly, note that we have a more diverse set of jobs. People are not pushed into having to do things like sex work when they did not want to and had no other industry to rely on. They push people into that, so those services are less provided. The impacts of this are pretty clear. Women stop getting abused. Economies become more stable because they're not dependent on things like crime. It disturbs locals' lives on their side. It amplifies every impact we're giving this debate. For these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
I would like to play the second competition for that line speech, and I would like to call upon second competition to continue with the case for all. Here, here.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this? Thanks. For a proposition that wants to tell you that tourism is no more than 30% of literally every other economy except for Macau, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense for the entire economic argument to be dependency bad, because according to them, dependency does not exist. So I think they need to pick a world in which either they considered that tourism was a big part of a bunch of different economies, and at that point, our argument about employment and unemployment becomes far more significant. I just think they get that facts wrong. It is not true that Macau is the only country that benefits from tourism. 45% of Maldives' GDP is tourism. 10% of Canada's jobs is tourism, more than finance and mining combined. They get their research wrong, and their research being wrong contradicts the entirety of their economics argument to start with. But let's be charitable and engage further. I will prove why you can. The problem with that is that they don't analyze why specifically tourism is subject to more shocks than anything else. You know what's going to happen to your service sector if a terrorist attack happens? I don't imagine it will operate perfectly without any consequences at all. The only thing they say is, aha, Instagram trends mean that we won't go there. Really? Paris will suddenly stop getting tourists because Instagram trends don't focus on Paris? This debate is not about like random tourist sites that no one has ever heard of. The motion literally says major tourist destinations. What is the problem? Why are people suddenly stopping going to Paris, to Rome, to Australia and Sydney? They never prove why tourism dependency is worse than literally anything else. I think what's clear in this debate so far should be that literally any economic developmental model has consequences in and of itself. So they could not just point to, aha, tourism has some harms without proving that their comparative was any better. I'll chat about that more when I get to the economics slash. 3 questions. First on regulation, whether we can take away all of the harms that they talk about. Second on economics. Thirdly on culture and locals. Before that, sure.
So what you're doing is you're being incredibly uncharitable. You're economically dependent on 30% of your economy. You can still pivot to the other 70% of your economy and diversify on that stuff.
I'll chat about why you can't, but again, you do agree that this is a big part of your economy and your jobs as well. So this is the one thing everyone agrees on. There are a lot of jobs that tourism rides on. We'll explain why those get worse on the asset of the house. First question then, on regulation. They say that regulation won't work because there are too many tourists. But like, why? The challenge in first opposition is that tourism gives you the money to hire more cops, gets no response. If there are too many tourists, hire more police officers. I have no idea why it is literally impossible to regulate just because there are more tourists. Then they say economic dependence on tourism is why you will not regulate. Because apparently regulation will turn away tourists. Right, because people are going to stop going to Rome just because you can't graffiti the Colosseum. This is an absurd argument. Just because we regulate against the worst harms possible does not mean that tourists evaporate from these sites. So that claim that there is no political will to regulate is just untrue. The third and final thing they say is that sex tourism on their side of the house is going to be better because sex tourism is impulsive and they stop this from occurring. They just make it go to non-major sites of tourism, so I have no idea why this changes. Instead of going to Bali in Indonesia, you go to a smaller village in Indonesia and do the same exact thing. If anything, the scrutiny on Bali is higher on our side of the house, which is why you see the Balinese authorities starting to regulate against this on our comparative. The second response I want to point out is that there are some evil people who will plan a year in advance and go do it anyway. I really don't understand what the margin here is. Sex tourism cannot be the biggest thing in the round. The 99% of tourists who don't engage in sex tourism, the money that they bring to economies probably automatically a lot more. With that, we prove that regulation is possible to a very large extent. The worst harms that they want to point out of graffitiing, of people being pushed out, and sex tourism just largely do not apply in the round. But let's be exceptionally charitable. In my third dash, I will later prove why even if you do not buy regulation as a perfect implementation on our side of the house, why the harms that they point out just don't work as well. But I want to note, insofar we prove regulation, a big chunk of the negative case goes away as well. On the second question then, about economics. I want to start by chatting about whether there's a problem in relying on tourism to start with. The claim that they make is that tourism being a big part of your economy stops diversification. And the mechanization that we get is second proposition saying one sentence that Western hotel companies stop diversification. How? Maybe you can't build a factory in front of the Crown Plaza in Belgrade on our side either, but why does the Crown Plaza care if you build a factory on the suburbs of Belgrade? Why does the Crown Plaza care about every single inch of land in Serbia? We imagine that they don't prove why industrialization or diversification is literally impossible on our side of the house. Clearly, there are areas in Serbia, clearly there are areas in India that we can happily industrialize as well. So their opportunity cost was one that just like existed in their heads. I have no idea why India getting some white people to come there means that India now won't have factories on our side of the house. Just think about how ludicrously absurd this claim is. Then they say that Hong Kong and Singapore economically developed. But I think this shows up our analysis and proves the mechanism that I just talked about, which is that you can have a lot of tourists in the country and also develop and industrialize your own financial sectors. You can also set up your own factories because that is what Hong Kong and Singapore did to start with. So I think those examples cut deeper into their case than it does to us. If anything, they prove our case for us. The next thing I want to respond to is the very Western-centric responses to our argument about forex reserves. They say four things, all of which only apply to the developed world. They say that forex reserves don't matter. To the Australian economy, maybe not, because credit raters rate the Australian economy very highly. You know who it does matter to? Countries like Pakistan, countries like Sri Lanka, that need massive forex ratings before anyone is going to put their money there. FDI will not come into our countries if we don't have the forex reserves to guarantee that to these investors that they can pull their money out, that their money won't be stuck in this economy, because without those forex reserves, you will not have the confidence to get the FDI to set up those factories that they so desperately want on their side of the house. Maybe on the absolute best case, Australia doesn't benefit. But you know who else benefits? China, Sri Lanka, India, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina. What about the rest of the developing world that they never wanted to talk about? Then they say Dutch disease happens and that this is a bad thing. But I would note there are a lot of developing countries around the world run trade deficits because they need to import a lot of goods. On our side, importing becomes a lot easier when the currency is managed better as a result of tourists coming there and giving you forex reserves. They say that this will not happen because people will trade currencies in America and then fly to Sri Lanka. But like, guys, the problem is not every single currency is an international currency. You can't convert in America US dollars to Sri Lankan rupees. You have to come to Sri Lanka and do it in the first place, which is why we think the forex reserves of Sri Lanka will be boosted up on our side of the house. Maybe you can convert Australian dollars, but like, guys, the rest of the world is not globalized to the extent that your economy is. The last thing I point out is that the vast majority of tourism is in the West. Like, intuitively, is this true? Probably not. There are a bunch of places in the developing world that do attract massive amount of tourists. There are bunches of people in the developing world who engage in tourism in each other's countries. Look at the millions of tourists from China that visit India, that visit South Korea, that visit Sri Lanka, that we think is going to be significantly beneficial on our side of the house. The implication to all of this is that the responsive strategy only works in places like Australia. Maybe the Australian economy will be fine. It will be fine either way because it's the Australian economy. The places that mattered more were the places like Maldives, were places like India that could actually get money on our comparative, and that they got rid of on their side. The implication to this was people had more jobs on our side of the house. When the hotel employed you and gave you a paycheck that you could feed your family with, this was important because they could not just say that they set up alternative industries without telling us what those alternative industries were. Fishing is not good enough. They set back development by decades because they take away the one comparative advantage countries like Maldives had in the first place. On our side, we would not sacrifice the certain benefit and industry that we already have for the speculative benefit of fishing being good enough on their comparative. Lastly, on culture, they say that culture is fetishized on our side of the house. Why is it not going to be fetishized when they still let some tourists in, as second proposition wants to concede to begin with? Then they say that locals are locked out of their services. But I want to flip this argument. It is because there are significant amounts of tourists in your cities that the Rome government has A, the capacity, because tourists give you the cash, and B, the incentive to improve things like the metro system. Because tourists will not come into a city that has a dysfunctional metro, right? So it is only on our side of the house that these places have the capacity and the incentive to improve things for local populations. A better metro, desalination plants if their concern is that there's not enough water. All of these things were exclusive to our side. The implication was tourists brought money. This mattered to the rest of the world, if not Australia. Opposed.
I would like to thank the second opposition speaker for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon the third proposition speaker to summarize the second part of this debate both offside. Here.
Over-tourism is not the kind of tourism that means you just go into a country and have a great time. What we're talking about in this debate is the kind of over-tourism that pushes people out of their homes, that raises inflation to a crazy degree, a problem that gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. Obviously, there is a limit. You cannot accept every single tourist into your country. That's what they never contend with. Where is that limit? We think that limit has been reached. We think these places are in such a dire need of changing their industries and diversifying. They cannot simply continue to rely on tourism. That is what Team Sri Lanka relegates them to. First, I'm going to talk about economy, and second, on the quality of life for residents. First thing then on economy. Note that they focus the bulk of their analysis on places like the Seychelles. We told you that first, like most of the countries that you go to are Western. Most of the countries we're talking about in this debate are Western. First, because they were the biggest places where tourists would go. Places like Paris and Barcelona. They were the places that had the most money. Second, because these tourists were Western, they typically have more money and were going into these places. They needed to contend with these people as well. These people who were in dire need. these people in Barcelona who were contending with the fact that they could no longer find houses to live with, they never consider any of these people. But I'll engage with all of their points on places like the Seychelles, which they say rely on tourism. Okay, the first thing they bring you is that this intuition pump that if these countries could diversify, they would anyway. The private companies don't care whether your industry is reliant on tourism. I'm going to tell you why that's not true and why their side actively, with over-tourism, stops governments from diversifying. First, it's because they suffer from things like the status quo bias, which is the exact thing that they're suffering from right now. They assume that because these countries have so much tourism that this is the only thing they can do. Second, it's because governments were inherently short-termist because they had electoral incentives and they weren't perfect actors. That meant they traded off what was a quick boost to the economy to things that will legitimately help them in the future, like investment into things like skills. Third, it was because they had a bias from the past. That they point out themselves that sometimes these countries were ones who had faced colonial past, and that meant that tourism had helped them get out of these situations. That led them to believe that this was their shining light and pushed them away from investing into other industries. Lastly, it's because people in these countries see low-level jobs in hotels and tour guides and never attempt to upskill. They are actively pushed into these industries instead of using government capital to push them out of it. Next, that's defeated their point. Let's proven at the end of that governments would put more money into things like investment, into things like skills, if their side wasn't encouraging things like over-tourism, which directly stopped them from doing this. Second thing to defeat them is what they say about countries have literally no other options, that they have only nice beaches and this is the only thing that they have. First, I think this is incredibly uncharitable, not only to us, but also to places like the Seychelles, which have great reserves and incredible natural resources that aren't used because of things like colonization, which push them back from using them. I'll tell you why they're able to diversify. First, it's because these places are highly attractive for things like investment and foreign direct investment. That was incredibly good for these countries. They're blocked for all the reasons I told you about how there was inherent tie-up in the tourism industry. If you told me a few decades ago that a place like Taiwan, which has really nice beaches and is relatively small, would only be a tourist hotspot, obviously now that seems ridiculous. They pushed into other industries, they pushed into other things like skill building. But second, it's because tourist caps actively get them to diversify, because it meant the government now wanted to reallocate things things into skill building, things like infrastructure so that people could work, things like fishing and farming, rather than on infrastructure for excessive tourism. That people get locked out on their side because they go into things like quick jobs rather than trying to upskill and trying to pursue other industries. Yes.
To be clear, you think that the Indian government won't bother to look at setting up a government factory because of the status quo bias that exists just because some hotels exist in India?
Okay. Look, you wanted to talk about places that aren't like India, which exclusively rely on tourism. I know that India is a place that doesn't rely on tourism quite obviously and has incredible other industries. I'm not sure how this helps you in the debate. At the end of that, we were the ones who pushed people, who encouraged governments to invest in other things. They never got to do that. We encouraged governments to diversify. That was incredibly good because tourism was a bad industry to have economically. Their only response is to say that every industry suffers things like shocks. We tell you that tourism is uniquely unstable because it's uniquely seasonal, because it's suspect to shocks like COVID, which killed entire industries and sent entire countries into poverty, but that it was also finite, that beaches' water quality would go down over time, that these could not last forever, that climate change would change your seas, and meant that if you focused on tourism, you would have literally no way in the future of providing money from your country. At the end of that, we were the ones who encouraged governments to diversify. We were the only ones who did that. On their side, they remained stagnant. They remained in these situations where people had no other employment opportunities but to work in things like hotels. If they wanted to relegate people to that, they could. On our side, we actually change things by pushing governments to change what they do. The last thing they bring you is that the last ditch attempt to save this is to say that the lack of foreign reserves means that you never diversify. First, obviously tourism and the physical exchange of money was never going to be the defining factor in whether you had foreign reserves or not. Obviously other industries, if you pushed into them, would also give you things like foreign reserves. Private companies could also do this. I don't think that was ever going to help them in this debate. The physical exchange of money was no longer what was the most defining factor in foreign currencies now, in foreign reserves, and we just told you that that probably wasn't going to be that helpful to that countries. Most countries don't actually directly focus on having strong foreign reserves. This was never going to be the most important thing in this debate. At the end of that, we clearly got better results for these people. Next then, on quality of life for the residents. What gets so little response is to things like the housing crisis. It's people in European countries literally being pushed out of the city, literally not being able to go to work because their trains are so built up by tourists taking up all their places. It's because governments were more likely to build these things into places where tourism was instead of places that would actually help people do things like get to work and pursue things that they actually needed to. They give so little response to that, except and I'd note that also buffers up the economy, because if we can prove that people are stopped by the fact that they have to be hurt by tourism, that they can no longer do the things that they need to do for their job, then that also stunts the economy. They need to respond to that. But then, next on culture, what we tell you is that you're forced to westernize your culture on their side, that you had to make your food more palatable, that you had to do things like fetishize massages and stuff. Their only response is to say that this helps people learn more about their cultures because they go to these places. First, this is obviously untrue because you had an incentive to play into stereotypes that Westerners wanted, to play into stereotypes which would make people spend more. These were the kind of things that film propagated but were not necessarily true to your culture. But second, it's because Westerners and people from bigger countries played into things like colonial power dynamics. They had the money and the purchasing power. You had to prostrate yourself. You had to make your culture more palatable for them. That was so harmful to these people because it was a massive impact to literally lose your whole culture, to lose your sense of life, to be someone living in Hawaii and have to give luau's to people every day. That was something that deeply harmed your sense of self. We told you also that you had things like destruction to monuments. Their only response is to say that they preserve cultures through rebuilding processes. This obviously wasn't enough. If you lose your individual culture, if you lose the history of these places, that is obviously a harm in itself. If you rebuilt the Library of Alexandria for me, that would not be enough. Things are good in their original form. They have huge importance to things like indigenous communities. They have huge importance to your sense of self. Last thing to say then is on culture and the brief response they give you on sex tourism, that it gets worse on their side. The first thing I'd note is that if you believed any of our points on diversification, then this is obviously untrue. On their side, people are pushed into these industries. They don't have a sense of choice. They don't have agency in choosing where they go. On our side, if you weren't just pushing into tourism, if you were actively incentivized to do things like build your skills, to do things like stay in education, you were far more likely to be able to directly seek other jobs. At the end of that, on our side, you were far more likely to keep your culture. You were far more likely to keep the monuments which had deep cultural importance to you. You were far more likely to have places to live, and your economy was far less likely to be dependent on something which was so harmful to you, which robbed you of your culture, which robbed you of being able to live your life in a normal way. So incredibly proud to propose.
I would like to thank Sir Rob for that speech, and I would like to call on Sir Off to someone to invite this speech. You're here.
Give me 1 second, please. The reason why Maldives picked the tourism industry is because they did not have any other place to diversify in the first place. They did not have a population that had the capacity to upskill and move into other industries as they want to characterize. They were in the middle of nowhere where the only thing that they had were the beaches in their countries. This is the counterfactual that they never engaged with. Their pivot towards suggesting that this debate is only about Western countries is not good enough because there are developing countries that are dependent on things like tourism. There are countries like Sri Lanka, India, Maldives that are dependent on tourism exclusively and are important to this debate. I'm going to clarify first what this debate is about in terms of regulations and whether we can achieve it, and then move on to two questions. First on the economics and second on culture. First, whether regulations will work. We pointed out three things here. The first is governments have an incentive to regulate because governments care about people coming in here when their entire revenue stream is dependent on the fact that they need over-tourism to exist within these regions for their economies to sustain itself. In instances where it does fail, it means that they cannot get the revenue that they have on our side, which is why they have an incentive to regulate. What is the implication of this? That is, governments will crack down on things like cocaine production, for example, as the second proposition wants to say, in instances if it means that people become uncomfortable, that they don't want to go to these regions in the first place because there's just so much of crime in these regions, or there's so much of uncertainty of what will happen to their life. So the implication of this is that governments have an incentive to regulate. The second thing that we pointed out is that capacity, if they can literally implement and fiat an auction system on their side of the house, I'm sure we can fiat some level of regulation existing on our side of the house as well. But the third thing we pointed out is that the capacity to regulate also significantly gets better over time, right? And there were two reasons that we suggested for this. The first reason is because they just have more money to regulate against things like housing crisis. Housing crisis is going to exist anyway because there's like a trend of overpopulation, or like climate change is going to occur anyway. Like in Serbia, you're running out of water because it is the heat that is happening out of nowhere. These things are going to happen anyway. The ability for governments to fund these things only exists if you have the money to do that. But the second thing that we pointed out is that the pressure on governments to regulate against these things also significantly increases, right? Like when you're moved out of your house and you don't have enough houses, that is when people can pressurize the governments to regulate as well. So regulation, even if as it exists, is not like perfect, it will get better over time because of the additional pressure that keeps increasing on governments. What is the implication of this? This takes out the vast majority of the case that they have. Their first argument on graffiti and like people doing bad things, their third argument on like people consuming cocaine, they will have a positive case at the end of this if they do not prove that regulation does not work. We've proven sufficiently that we can fiat some regulation and it keeps getting better over time. We win this debate already, but let's answer two questions additionally just so that we clear the win, right? The first is on economics. The first thing I want to point out is deal with their argument on diversification, and the second thing I want to prove in this argument is that even if diversification does not happen on our side of the house, where the tourism industry is the best industries that these countries have and need to stay in this, taking us on our absolute worst case in a world in which diversification cannot happen. The first thing, why can diversification still happen on our side? And like the argument on diversification, I want to point out a couple of missing links from the proposition here. The first is that they never pointed out why diversification is important in the first place. Why is this industry so different to the tourism industry? Their damage controlling third proposition is that, well, this is seasonal. I want to point out two things. The first is fluctuations in demand happens in every other industry as well. I don't understand why this is uniquely volatile when it comes to tourism. But second, we are talking about major tourist destinations. Like the Eiffel Tower is always overcrowded, guys. It is not overcrowded in like particular seasons of the year, which is why like their seasonal harm does not make sense as well. This is true of every other tourist sites that are going to exist on their side as well. So I don't understand the necessity to diversify in the first place. The second missing link in the argument is that they never prove why they can diversify in the first place. We pointed out several countries that just don't have the capacity to diversify. Firstly, because they don't have any other industry like the Maldives. But secondly, is that they don't have the money to diversify, and the money uniquely comes from tourism, and then they diversify. Look at Maldives, for example. In the past, their entire economy was dependent on like the tourism industry, but over time, they have entered the financial sector because they're able to use this money. So over-tourism is essential in the short term for these countries for them to be able to diversify in the long term as they suggest. But the third thing I want to point out is that they never prove why this is exclusive on our side, because we pointed out governments do have an incentive, right? And the reason for this is diminishing marginal utility. At some point in time, it just becomes so much so that there is no additional benefit that you get from like tourism, to the point where governments are forced to shift to other industries because their labor sector is just packed with tourism, that there are still people who are unemployed, that they need to find jobs for them, and that is the point at which they divert to other industries and they start building those industries as well, and people will pressurize the governments to do this. The fourth missing link is that why is this beneficial in the first place, which leads me on to the second part of this clash, right? That is that That is why even if diversification does not happen on our side of the house, why the tourism is the best industry that these people have. And there are two exclusive reasons that we gave to you, in first opposition by the way, that they never responded to. The first is that these industries are labor intensive. That when it comes to things like tourism, you need people on the ground to welcome other people into the country. But when it comes to other industries, like like industrialization and like factories, for example, it is the machines that do the work. The need for labor does not exist in other industries as it does in the tourism industry, which is why we can guarantee all people jobs, versus on that side, some people will always be left jobless, even if they have the benefit of upskilling. Secondly, why can upskilling still happen? They don't prove where they get the funds from. They say auctioning. Is the funds from auctioning good enough when you only have like 5 rich people coming in, versus on our side, you have the funds from like billions and billions of people who come into the country and spend, significant amounts of money, and the additional funding that we get on our side, because rich people are going to spend significant amounts on either side, right? We get the added benefit of the middle class and the other people who spend on our side, which is why we have additional funding to do things like upskilling and get that benefit as well. The second exclusive benefit that we gave you is the foreign capital and the foreign direct investment. We pointed out that foreign reserves are significantly important because it cites to other countries in terms of their currency stability, which is why investor confidence is boosted, which is why other industries also start coming in a world in which tourism industry also exists, because you get more spotlight when you also have your factories there. What is the importance of this? Two things. Firstly, this is a certain benefit when it comes to the tourism industry for countries that don't have an additional comparative advantage. Secondly, is that the long-term industrialization is not something that is mutually exclusive, but on our side of the house, the harm of tourism is guaranteed on that side. Yeah.
So, Malta is in the middle of nowhere and poor, and therefore can't diversify. Hong Kong and Singapore also were in the middle of nowhere and poor. What's the difference between these two countries?
Yeah, Hong Kong was in the middle of nowhere, but they started things like tourism and then they can diversify. If this debate is about countries that don't have major tourist sites, then that doesn't make sense either. Third thing under this question in terms of other regional development, again, unengaged argument as to why other regions within that same country become more popular. Like people go to Sri Lanka to visit the Sigiriya, and then they go to like Jaffna, for example, to visit the Kobles there. This benefit only exists on our side of the house, or in an instance where they do go to that country because of the major tourist site existing and the ability to go there. The economic benefit does not flow through to other things. Thirdly then, in terms of cultural and environmental benefit, the first thing I want to point out is that their example on like airports being built in forests does not make sense, because you still need forests for like people to come and visit the forest, which is probably a tourist site on our side of the house. Whereas on their side, they will break down the forest to build factories, which is because it does not bring any benefit on that side. The second thing I want to point out is that like the stereotypes argument does not make sense. If it means people have food on the ground and like food to put on the table, it does not matter because of stereotypes. Those are going to exist on either side of the house. At least we can break it without needing to appease to like some billionaires on our side. For all these reasons, oppose.
I would like to thank the third opposition speaker for an fine speech, and I would like to welcome opposition reply to some of the opponents that have been here.
Australia's economic harm of maybe sometimes there might be risks through economic dependence was not good enough. Because what were these major sites of tourism that suffered so much as a result of depending too much on tourism, and now the economies no longer exist? We comparatively had examples pointing out that tourism mattered significantly to a bunch of different countries. Nepal, Costa Rica, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. We were not willing to sacrifice broad swaths of the developing world just because they could make the Australian economy 1% more secure and 1% more resilient to risk. They have no positive case at the end of this debate. Two parts of victory on opposition. First, on economic development, where we win quite clearly. Second, on the lives of residents improving on our side. Our second argument that receives barely any response about why we better protect cultural heritage sites on our side. Firstly, on economic development, I think the engagement in this clash through both sides fall to an extent, gets quite messy. So I think what's important here is to break this down into groups. There are different kinds of countries in different circumstances. The first type of countries that we think matters are countries with not a lot else going for it, countries that are dependent on tourism. Why was it that our case was winning by a wide margin in this set of countries? Because we pointed out that this was the most profitable method of earning cash in foreign currencies, by the way. They say that fishing exists. They say that surely something else needs to exist, that you can maybe turn your people to once tourism goes away. But this is an uncharitable response, because our claim from first was that these countries depend on tourism because this was the best thing for them to do. This was the one thing that they had a comparative advantage over the rest of the world at, and it was that thing that we guaranteed and secured for these countries on our side. Maybe the Maldives can fish, but you know what? India also fishes, and India is probably slightly better at it. The Maldives is much better than everyone else at tourism, and that is the thing that we were unwilling to take away from these countries. We pointed out that for these countries, getting forex mattered a lot. They gave you 4 responses as to why the Australian economy doesn't need forex. We gave you responses as to why the rest of the world does. Third proposition drops this entirely. The implication to this is that we get cash. That cash then translates into investment from abroad, because FDI becomes more likely when your currency is more stable, because again, we get more forex reserves on our side of the house. So the best case implication was industrialization mattered. We actually gave you the means and mechanism to get to industrialization because we made FDI more likely on our competitor to start with. The way here is that the long term on our side better achieves the best case on their side, which is they want industrialization. We just get to it in a far more secure way on our comparative. The next set of countries that I think matters are countries that have the capacity for other things beyond tourism to start with. But they never tell you why exactly these countries can't industrialize. Because all they say in second proposition is, aha, big evil Western company stops this. We point out that this is absurd in my speech. The Crown Plaza isn't going to stop industrialization of the suburbs of Belgrade, right? They don't respond to this in third proposition. They don't respond when we point out that regional inflation in Skadalia in Belgrade does not mean that you can't set up a factory in literally any other plot of land in Serbia to start with. So they don't actually prove why industrialization is literally impossible in literally everywhere else beyond these major tourist sites in these countries. Third proposition says that India doesn't count. We agree. India isn't going to be stopping industrialization as a result of just having some hotels, and that was the response that beat their case as opposed to our case. So the implication here is that the countries that could industrialize will do it anyway. The countries that can't industrialize get cash on our side of the house that feeds people's families. That cash was the cash that got to industrialization in the long term in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka on our side. They needed to engage rather than talking about Australia's economy. On the second question, why is it that lives of residents are better? A, regulation. They don't engage charitably. We can regulate against a lot of these harms, and the incentives to local governments to care about local voters, which we point out in first opposition, is unresponded to. Second, even if you don't buy regulation, my response in second opposition, that third proposition drops, which is that governments get the capacity to improve things on our side of the house through this cash. You build a better subway, so that concern was the metros that were crowded. We could expand the metro with the cash that tourists brought. Finally, our argument about preservation. We told you that forests matter to you and the government on our side of the house. When the forest gets you cash, on their side, cutting down the forest, tearing down these cultural sites of preservation makes more sense. Ours was the only side that they made these sites economically valuable.
I would like to thank opposition reply for that kind of speech, and I would like to call on Trump reply for the last debate. You're here.
Good to go. The speculative chain of logic for this team loses them the debate. You have to believe that you end up spending more money on their side when we prove that it's exclusive and you would like to spend more money on our side. Then you have to believe that the money that goes to Western hotel companies, who somehow start paying their workers well, then cycles through the economy. The direct way we explained was there was an auction system where you'd be likely to spend more that would go directly to the government, and then they could reallocate that. But even if you did believe that money would eventually cycle through the economy, you then had to believe that it was cycled through enough so that we could reparate the people that we pushed out of the city, build enough houses for them, even though they lived really far away. And even if you did believe that at the end, you then had to believe that it was okay to trade off pushing people out of Hawaii, meaning that they could not live in their home city, that was culturally important to them, often religiously important to them because they were native people, that was an okay harm to trade off to those people. We said that governments had an obligation to the people that live there, should care about them the most. A couple of things in this speech. First thing, I'm going to talk about where this debate takes place, because I think that's where the bulk of uncharitableness comes from the opposition. Next thing I'll talk about is why this is good for the citizens in the country that are there, and then lastly on the economy. So firstly, on where this debate takes place, we tell you it's places like Western countries, they tell you it's places like the Seychelles. Why should you weigh our characterization as more likely than theirs? Two reasons. Firstly, I would ask you to name a major tourist destination. Lots of you would probably think Paris, New York. I think it's more intuitive that you think of those places because they just do happen to have more people going there than the ones that they name. They try and push you that, oh, the Maldives is a major tourist destination. I'm unclear that it is. I'm clear that Paris is. You should probably weigh that as more likely. But secondly, we explain to you that Western tourists are more biased towards going to Western destinations for two reasons in our speech. The first one is that they're just biased towards their own places because they're culturally similar. But secondly, it's geographically similar. If you're in Europe, you're more likely to go to European countries. You ought to go to countries that are further away, so you should weigh that as more likely because you were there. That means that the bulk of characterization we give you about Western countries, we protect their sites and they'll still be fine economically, but even if it does go to other countries, we still win the debate there. They never engage on our grounds in this debate, so we end up at least winning half of it. Next thing to do is to explain how it is good for the citizens in the country that are there. We give you a bulk of harms that are basically unresponded to. The first one is a sense of environmental damage that happens. We tell you that hurts everyone. The thought that the pyramids are being attacked is something that hurts people who aren't even from Egypt, which specifically hurts the people who are from Egypt. Second response is we give you there are a bunch of things like malicious tourists doing things like graffiti in Colosseum. The third thing we tell you is that there are things like access to services. You get pushed out of public transport. That just makes your life awful. We also explain the second proposition that lowers economic productivity. Gets their harm. Fourth thing we tell you is that there are things like the housing crisis. We push people out of cities that they have cultural connection to. We just make it harder, live in worse places, and often people's rents go up, they lose lots of money. That is economically depressing for these people. Even if you rise their wages, housing prices go up so much that that is harmful for them. Fifth thing we explain is that they're culturally exploited. They try to say they can do regulations. Maybe they can. We already gave the reasons why they probably didn't have the fiat to do, but if they could, why were they not doing it anyway? Unclear on that. Next thing they try to do is go, well, the side proposition is probably winning by a margin on this. Let's try and weigh it out of the debate. What are the two metrics they give you at third opposition? First, climate change happens anyway, so why should we care about the environment? Is climate change going to happen anyway? Probably untrue that it is. But also, lots of the harms we give you are direct environmental harms like sewage leaks. Second thing they tell you is overpopulation happens anyway. Doesn't mean you have to add extra people to that and accrue an even bigger harm. Unclear why that's true. But thirdly, economic growth probably happens anyway, right? If you believe this is a weighing metric, it doesn't get them anywhere in the debate. We tell you our benefits are more true because first, their benefits that they get are short term. Sam explains in his speech that the wave breaks in Costa Rica no longer exist because you build up hotels so that people stop going there and there are a bunch of hotels that no one visits, and therefore people don't do the tourism, so they only get short term benefits on their side. We have more sustainable economic benefits. But secondly, our harm is more certain. And thirdly, we have a wide variety of impacts. I gave you 5 different ones. They only trade one small part of the economy they don't win on. Let's go on their economy material, noting that by the end of this, I think it's short term and probably not even something that they can win on. They tell you that there is a certain benefit of adding the middle class. It's unclear the speculative logic chain we explained at the start. This goes to the government. We explain this more direct on our side. And not even if it is true, it's seasonal, so you don't get to claim this benefit all the time. Half the time these people are unemployed. We lower the delta by capping people in summer, so it's similar to people in winter, so people more have jobs. But they tell you they can't do things like diversify. But note that 3O says Hong Kong did diversify. They used to do things like doing lots of tourism. They could. Next thing they say is they would anyway. Alice explains that governments are short-term bias. Governments do make bad decisions. To buy that argument, you have to believe the government never makes a bad decision. Untrue. Now, lastly, on currency, unclear you need this much more currency because we still have some tourism on their side. They act like it's a banned tourism debate. They are unable to claim benefits. We still have enough currency. Power to propose.